The fantasy playoffs are officially here, and by scrolling through the comment section on videos, there's a lot of people in Headliner Nation vying for some fantasy football trophies. In fact, we may just have as many backup quarterbacks starting in the NFL this week, and that definitely takes a toll on the production of a lot of wide receivers. So in today's show, we're taking a look at wide receivers we should start and sit in Week 15. What is going on, Headliner Nation? Hopefully everyone's doing well out there today. We're talking about wide receivers. We're going to start and sit in Week 15 of fantasy football. The fantasy football playoffs are here. And unfortunately, we have a butt ton of backup quarterbacks playing in the NFL right now. Now, while that isn't ideal, there are also a lot of backup quarterbacks that are playing extremely well right now. And I'm pretty sure we're going to talk about a few guys that you can fit into your lineups here to help make that championship run. But first, I need to announce a giveaway winner. It was in this show last week that I announced the giveaway of a signed Brandon Ayuk mini helmet right here. Well, the next week is here. It's time to announce a winner. So we randomly selected a winner, and the winner is going to be Rhonda T 8764. Congratulations. Send me an email over to info@thefantasyheadliners.com, and I will go ahead and get you hooked up there thanks to our friends over at Pristine Auction. If you haven't signed up for a free Pristine Auction account yet, you need to absolutely do so. We don't make a dime off Pristine Auction, but what we do get is a ton of sweet giveaway items like that to give away to you, the viewer. The only way we can do that is if you continue to sign up and use their site. I want to continue to do giveaways for years on years, so be sure to check them out. But also, just as important, but it's Wednesday, right? So that means we need to talk about our Compassion Kids of the Week. The season is winding down, and I got to continue to try to find ways to make the world just a little bit better each and every week if possible. Now, if you're not interested in that, I understand there are timestamps down below for whatever matchup you're looking for. But I absolutely love our partnership here with Compassion International, and there is nothing that I would like more as a Christmas gift to myself than trying to find more sponsors for more kids here prior to Christmas. What an amazing Christmas gift that we could give to kids all around the world just by helping take them out of that extreme poverty situation. So let's go ahead and meet this week's Compassion Kid of the Week. Everyone say hello to King. Little King here is only 2 years old, lives in Rwanda, and has been waiting for a sponsor for 363 days. Is anyone out there in Headliner Nation able to help Little King change his life? Now, I have a link down below in the description. It's compassion.com/headliners. If you go to that website, you'll be able to scroll through a list of children. You'll be able to find King, or you can search for him by his child ID that was just up on the screen. Now, if you get to that site and you can't find King, maybe he's already been sponsored. That is a good thing, but there are still tons of other children available there on that site that need our help. Over the last 7 years, I've seen what this community can do, and together we can help make a difference in this world, and I'm looking forward to continue to do this each and every year with Compassion International. So once again, if you're interested, it's compassion.com/headliners, links down below in the description. But all right, let's talk about some football now. We got football in multiple days. We got Thursday football, Saturday football, Sunday football, Monday football, everywhere here for the next few weeks. And we're kicking off Thursday night with the Los Angeles Chargers and Las Vegas Raiders. And what is about to happen with Keenan Allen now that we no longer have Justin Herbert for the rest of the season? Especially now since it sounds like we're also going to be getting back Josh Palmer to this offense. The ceiling for Keenan Allen obviously has to come down. I like the young quarterback in Easton Stick, but he's not Justin Herbert. And I wouldn't be surprised over the next couple weeks if we don't see a couple extra shots down the field towards Quentin Johnston. Plus, we know there's going to be some targets going the way of Josh Palmer. Now, I still expect Keenan Allen to lead this team in targets. We just need to pray that they're all catchable targets. That's great if a wide receiver can go out and get 11 targets, but if only 5 of them are catchable, that's not a lot of quality. Now they get a matchup going up against Las Vegas. They allow the 10th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. In their last meeting, Keenan Allen only had 3 catches for 32 yards. Luckily, saved the fantasy day with a touchdown that week as well. Plus, we also know that Keenan Allen is continuing to play through a heel injury, and due to a short week, is probably not going to practice very much. Now, with the difficult matchup, the Herbert injury, we got to limit those expectations for sure on Keenan Allen, especially since he's not 100% healthy as well. With a few extra targets going the way of Quentin Johnston and Josh Palmer for the first time in what feels like almost the entire season, Keenan Allen's probably going to be ranked outside my top 12 wide receivers this week. How about on the other side of the ball, Davante Adams, Jacoby Myers? The struggles continue in the passing game here in Las Vegas. Now, obviously, Davante Adams is going to continue to lead this team in targets, but he's not doing anything with it. Adams only has 3 games all year long where he finished inside the top 20 at the position. Let that sink in for a second. Plus, he's only had 1 touchdown since week 3. This is Davante Adams we're talking about, and he's not doing a whole lot of anything. He's scored single-digit fantasy points in 7 of his last 9 games, and it's really not much better for Jakobi Meyers. He's finished outside the top 40 at the position in 3 of his last 4 games played, and has had 50 yards or less receiving in 6 of his last 7 games. But now they get a matchup going up against the Chargers. They allow the 4th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Now, neither Adams or Myers had a big game against these Chargers back in week 4, but the matchups aren't going to get any easier going forward. The volume remains there weekly for Davante Adams, and that makes him still a little bit safer. We also know there's an injury to Josh Jacobs. He's currently questionable with a quad injury, and if he's limited at all, maybe we see even more volume in the passing offense. It's just hard to go into a week expecting anything from this passing offense as a whole. It's just been bad for so many weeks. Adams is going to remain a top 20 wide receiver for me, where Jakobi Meyers probably going to be on the outside of my top 30 rankings in week 15. Now is the time we typically go into some Sunday football, but no, not this week. We have Saturday football. The first game up, the Minnesota Vikings and Cincinnati Bengals will kick it off in Minnesota. And man, I would love for this to be a Kirk Cousins, Justin Jefferson matchup going up against Joe Burrow and Jamar Chase. But unfortunately, it's the battle of Nick Mullins and Jake Browning, and technically as of right now, Justin Jefferson is questionable to play. However, he came out earlier on Wednesday and said, hey, I'm going to play in this game on Saturday. And honestly, that's really enough for me. If we know Justin Jefferson is playing, he's in our fantasy football lineups. But what about like Jordan Addison? Is he somebody we can count on here in week 15? Probably not. He hasn't scored double-digit fantasy points in a game now for a month. KJ Osborne, he only has 3 games all year long in which he scored 10 plus fantasy points, and 2 of those came in the first 3 weeks of the season. There's just not enough shots down the field to put up any big numbers, and you have to think with a healthy Justin Jefferson, he's going to see the bulk of the volume. And now they get a matchup going up against Cincinnati, who allows right around the league average to opposing wide receivers. We also know that Alexander Mattison, he's questionable to play this week, along with 3 members of the offensive line. Nick Mullins may not have hardly any time in the pocket to let anything develop down the field to Justin Jefferson, let alone other wide receivers. As of right now, the only wide receiver in Minnesota I'm considering inside my top 30 is going to be Justin Jefferson. Everyone else is a big play, touchdown dependent style wide receiver, and in case you haven't noticed, not a whole lot of touchdowns going through the air here in Minnesota as of late. So what about on the Cincinnati side of the football? We got Jamar Chase, we got T. Higgins. Now, thanks to the play of Jake Browning, we still have wide receivers in Cincinnati that are fantasy viable. But when you think back on the season, and you think of all the Joe Burrow injuries, and then you look at Jamar Chase's overall stat line of 89 catches for 1,092 yards and 7 touchdowns, it's crazy to think what could have been with a healthy Joe Burrow all year long. Now, we know he's someone that we're going to lock in our lineups weekly. Jamar Chase is healthy, he's starting. But after that, it gets a little bit fuzzy. Because even though Browning is playing great, after Chase, everyone else is fighting for like 4 targets a game. And now they get a matchup going up against Minnesota. They allow the 13th most fantasy points per game. Now, when you look at the injury report, you're going to see both Tyler Boyd and Jamar Chase are currently on there. Now, while I think a lot of this has to do with just giving these guys a little bit of rest, I expect both of them to play here this weekend. But with all that being said, these are must-win games for Cincinnati. If they want to have any opportunity to sneak into the playoffs, they can't lose another game. And with the way the volume is distributed in this offense, I don't see how we can trust anyone outside of Jamar Chase. Now, I will say this. The big playability of T. Higgins has kind of been sneaking up a little bit here over the past 2 weeks, and he may be a Verge top 30 play for us here in Week 15. On to the second Saturday game now, the Pittsburgh Steelers, Indianapolis Colts, and we'll kick it off in Pittsburgh because I have a real question to ask you, the viewers out there. Is there anyone out there that actually enjoys and looks forward to watching this Pittsburgh passing offense? I didn't. Maybe Matt Canada and his family look forward to it, but that's probably just about it. Pittsburgh is among one of the worst offenses in all of the league, and it absolutely shows week in and week out. But Mitchie Biscuits was a top 10 fantasy quarterback last week. He had to help out the wide receivers, right? No, Deontay Johnson, 3 catches for 57 yards, was saved with a touchdown. George Pickens, 5 catches for 19 yards. How does that even make sense? Jaylen Warren was actually second on this team in receiving with 29 yards, if that tells you anything. It's the epitome of dink and dunk down the field. Now a matchup going up against Indianapolis. They allow the 12th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and actually they're easier to run on than they are to throw on, which means you know Pittsburgh going to be running that football. The passing game overall is fairly healthy, but the defense in Pittsburgh is absolutely decimated. Plus, we also know that Najee Harris continues to play banged up and is once again questionable to play this week. I don't see how anyone can look at any of these wide receivers in Pittsburgh and feel comfortable starting them. I'm still leaning Deontay Johnson just due to the volume alone, but even he is going to be a Verge top 30 play for me here this week. Also, free George Pickens, WTF. All right, on to Indianapolis. Now, someone I feel very comfortable starting each and every week is Michael Pittman, the current overall wide receiver 11, 10 plus fantasy points now in 9 straight games, averaging over 10 targets per game, and has a catch rate over 75%. He's been one of the best wide receivers in fantasy football all year long, and he remains a must-start guy each and every week. The part that is a mystery to me, though, is after Michael Pittman, because Will Mallory, Kylan Granson, and Zach Moss all had more targets than Alec Pierce and Josh Downs, in a game that Indianapolis was trailing most of the second half, and to me, that makes no sense. Josh Downs hasn't had over 43 yards receiving in a game since Halloween now. Now they get a matchup going up against Pittsburgh, though, and they allow just less than the league average to opposing wide receivers, but with all the injuries of the Pittsburgh defense, they are now vulnerable through the air. We saw Bailey Zappi put up 21 points in a half last week against this defense. Now, when it comes to injuries, the overall offense fairly healthy. Offensive tackle Braden Smith is questionable. Would love to have him out there and available in week 15, but Pittman remains the locked-in weekly must-start guy in everyone's lineup just due to the volume alone. The other wide receivers, I can't trust them in fantasy football, not with the volume that we see going the way of the other tight ends and running backs, both Downs and Pierce. They're going to be super high-risk plays. Which then takes us to our last game on Saturday, my Manscaped matchup of the week, the Denver Broncos and Detroit Lions. And listen, I'm all about making great memories on the holidays. And what better memory could you make on Christmas morning than having a brother, a son, a grandpa, a dad, anyone open up a gift from Manscaped? Now, maybe your family's a little bit more reserved and you don't want to open up some ball hair trimmers under the tree. I get it, but there's so much more than just that. Anything from boxer briefs to deodorant to shampoo, conditioner, body wash, whatever it is you need, they have you covered. But do not go out there and pay full price for it. Use the referral code HEADLINERS at checkout so you can get 20% off your order and free shipping. But what about Courtland Sutton? Another week and another touchdown. Jerry Jeudy, another week, another 16 yards or so. Courtland Sutton right now has had touchdowns in all but 3 games this season. It's almost automatic at this point. I still don't understand where the volume is at, though. Why are they not giving this guy more targets? He's only had 2 games all year long with more than 8 targets in a game. He's had 6 games this year with 5 targets or less and is still the overall wide receiver 21. You want to hear a crazy stat? If Courtland Sutton averaged just 1 more reception per game, he would be up inside the top 12 wide receivers in fantasy football, but yet they just don't give him more volume. Now they get a matchup going up against Detroit. They allow the 9th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. Overall, this offense is healthy in Denver, and the Broncos have only 1 less win than the Kansas City Chiefs for the division lead. That is crazy to say. They have to keep winning ball games, and Sutton has been the guy willing them to victory, not Jerry Jeudy. Sutton is the guy we're locking into our lineup once again in week 15. How about for Detroit? It's Amon-Ra St. Brown. And week 14 was a huge disappointment for so many people. His worst game of the season and his first game of the season in single-digit fantasy points. He had his chances, though. He had 9 targets, but he only brought in 3 of them for 21 yards and just seemed a little bit off. He still led the team in targets, though, so we're not hitting the panic mode here just yet, especially since the Lions have lost 2 of their last 3 games and need to get wins desperately. No other wide receiver in this offense sees enough volume to be considered here, especially in a critical week like week 15. A matchup going up against Denver, though, kinda sucks. They allow the 6th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and by no means is this matchup safe at all. The biggest injury concerns here on this offense is in the offensive line, where they continue to have multiple guys each and every week on the injury report. In crucial weeks like this, though, we have to start our studs. We can't get cute and sit Amon-Ra St. Brown in week 15. I don't think there's anyone out there that really wants to sit Amon-Ra in week 15. Plus, it's a home game, and you know them Lions play a little bit better at home. Which will now finally take us to Sunday football, the first matchup up, the Atlanta Falcons and Carolina Panthers. Now for Atlanta, heck yeah, I hope everyone capitalized off the matchup that we had from Drake London last week. His best receiving day of the year, 11 targets, 10 receptions, 172 yards receiving, but it was only his second game this year with 10 plus targets. But let's not get cocky and overconfident with Drake London. He remains a solid option in decent matchups because there isn't many other options in this overall offense to throw to. But this isn't one of those good matchups going up against Carolina. They allow the 5th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and a lot has happened since week 1, but that was the last time these two teams faced off. In that matchup, Drake London had 0 catches. There are also 3 members of the offensive line who are questionable to play in Atlanta, not going to give Desmond Ridder a whole lot of time to let plays develop down the field. Plus, do we really think that Arthur Smith is going to continue to force feed the ball to Drake London? No, probably not. But I hate to say it because really when I watch Drake London, I kind of compare him to Michael Pittman a little bit. If they could see similar roles, Drake London could definitely be up there inside the top 12 to 15 wide receivers in the NFL. He just doesn't get consistent volume. However, this week, probably going to be hovering right around the top 25 to 30 wide receivers. All right, what about Carolina? After watching what we did last week, I don't think anyone can look at this offense in Carolina and see any pieces of this passing offense and be like, you know what? I want to start him. I mean, Bryce Young's play is getting worse and worse by the week, and it's not all his fault. This offense overall is just playing ridiculously bad. The Panthers as a team haven't scored over 18 points in their last 7 games played. The 3rd lowest scoring team in the NFL. Atlanta is a great defense, allowing the 4th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. And back in week 1, Adam Thielen in that game, even though he started the season hot, only had 2 catches for 12 yards. It's not like Jonathan Mingo is out there absolutely killing it either. This whole offense at this point is basically a fantasy football sit. And more than likely, I'm probably going to have Adam Thielen outside my top 30 wide receivers here in week 15. Which will then take us out to Cleveland for the Browns and the Chicago Bears. For the Bears, we know it's just DJ Moore. And Justin Fields has now played 3 games since returning from injury. In all 3 of those games, DJ Moore has finished as a top 12 overall wide receiver in fantasy football, averaging 20 fantasy points per game over that stretch. He's had 9 plus targets in all 3 of those games, and we even saw him get a rushing touchdown last week in week 14. Now, we have started to see Darnell Mooney get a little bit more volume in this offense, but he's really not doing anything with it. He had 7 targets in week 14, but only ended with 2 catches for 44 yards. DJ Moore remains the only guy worth considering in Chicago at the wide receiver position, but this matchup sucks going up against Cleveland. They allow the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. However, Cleveland has given up over 27 points to opponents in 4 of their last 5 games played, so there is a little bit of hope. This offense, for the most part in Chicago, is overall fairly healthy, but with a worrisome matchup here, there is one thing that is going to help DJ Moore. It's the way they move him around the field, whether he's playing outside in the slot, getting carries out of the backfield. Getting him the ball in different ways definitely helps his floor week in and week out. He may not be inside my top 10 this week, but probably still going to be a top 12 to 15 option. But what about for Cleveland? Air Flacco has brought life back to the Cleveland offense. Over 250 yards passing in each of his 2 games, and 5 total passing touchdowns over those 2 games as well, is really starting to give a little bit of hope to Amari Cooper and Elijah Moore. Cooper last week had 14 targets. That's the most he's seen in any game this season. Sure, he only turned into 7 catches for 77 yards and had a costly fumble, but the volume that we saw is absolutely promising. Also, it really keeps him in that low-end wide receiver 2 category weekly. Now, Elijah Moore, he's seeing volume, but it's not all catchable. And you know, over here, we all about them catchable targets. He's had 18 targets over the last 2 weeks, which is great. Only turning into 7 receptions, though, which is not great. But now they get a matchup going up against Chicago, and they allow a little bit less than the league average to opposing wide receivers, but the last month of the season, they have been drastically improved in Chicago. They just held that Detroit offense in check just last week, and we saw the bad game that Amon-Ra had. We also know that here in Cleveland, Jerome Ford is questionable to play. If he can't go, if he's limited, you gotta believe we're gonna throw the ball even more in Cleveland. When the matchup isn't great, you have to go with the guy with volume. The guy with volume in this offense is Amari Amari Cooper. And the more that Amari Cooper and Joe Flacco play together, the better that connection is going to get. Cooper's going to be a little bit higher in my rankings, but like I said, more of a Verge top 24 guy. Which will then take us to the Battle of the Bays. Tampa Bay and Green Bay. Will kick it off in Tampa Bay because that Mike Evans dud game last week came at a horrible time for so many people. 1 catch for 8 yards on 6 targets. That just isn't going to cut it. But no wide receiver had a great game there in week 14 for Tampa Bay. Even Chris Godwin, who had 11 targets, only turned it into 5 catches for 53 yards. Bad games are just going to happen even though they suck. That does not mean we write off Mike Evans going forward. He's the current wide receiver 9 overall in fantasy football and averaging 17.2 fantasy points per game. Now, prior to week 14, he had 20 plus fantasy points in 3 of his last 4 games played. Godwin, we kind of expect the lower performance from him, right? The dude always hovers right around 7 to 10 fantasy points a week. That's about normal. But now they get a matchup going up against Green Bay. And on paper, it says they allow the 8th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but it sure helps that the last 2 teams they've played are Kansas City and the New York Giants, 2 teams who really aren't exactly rolling out high-end wide receiver studs weekly. Plus, we still have Jair Alexander, who is questionable to play this week for the Green Bay Packers. The dude is basically the defensive version of Christian Watson. He's always hurt. Now, in a week with no bye weeks, there's not going to be a lot of teams that are having to start Chris Godwin, which I understand. But don't let last week's dud game deter you from starting Mike Evans and keeping him in your lineup. The opportunity for him to have a big game happens so often, it would be a huge risk just to sit him. What about in Green Bay? And what a great matchup this is for Green Bay, right? And they need it after what happened to them last week. Remember that big day that we talked about earlier in this show from Drake London? Well, that was against this same Tampa Bay defense that the Green Bay is going to see here this week. At this point, I'm basically locking in Jayden Reed as a weekly top 25 wide receiver as well. It's his involvement on the ground and in the air, which has really helped his floor and made him a consistent weekly start. Especially when you add in the fact of a great matchup like this. What's crazy is he's doing a lot of his production without racking up receiving yards. He hasn't had over 50 yards receiving in a game in a month, but he's getting rushing touchdowns and rushing opportunities, and those are fantasy points just as well. This matchup going up against Tampa Bay, they allow the 6th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and their secondary is still missing multiple starters. We already know that Christian Watson is banged up and Aaron Jones is banged up, but we also added Dontavian Wicks to the injury report here this week with a high ankle sprain. He is questionable to play. That should be good news for Romeo Doubs. But for whatever reason, they have stopped giving Romeo Doubs looks inside the red zone like they were earlier in the season. Reed remains the guy to start in this offense, but if you want a Hail Mary flex play, Romeo Doubs could be that guy for you in week 15. Which will take us back out to Miami now for the Dolphins and the Jets. And for Garrett Wilson, I really don't have anything new to say about Garrett Wilson that I haven't already said all year long. Lock him in right around wide receiver 25. Pencil him in for 10 plus targets a week and right around 7 catches a week as well. He's a safe weekly flex start for everyone out there who plays fantasy football, especially when Zach Wilson is playing quarterback. You know he's looking the way of Garrett Wilson a ton in what could be a potential shootout against Miami. Miami allows the 14th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and we saw that defense in Miami get a little bit tired and lazy late in that game against Tennessee last week. I just love it when we know what a guy's role is. It makes this so much easier week in and week out. Even for those guys who don't have a huge ceiling, Garrett Wilson, we know what to expect each and every week, and safe floors are a good thing this time of year as well in fantasy football. How about Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle? Everyone wants to know what's going to happen with Tyreek Hill. He left week 14 with a high ankle sprain, looked like he was done for the day. Then came back in late in that game and looked just like Tyreek Hill. Now, you have to think he's going to get treatment and rest all week long, but they definitely need him out there on the field for sure. This offense looks completely different when he's not out there. For whatever reason, they just don't utilize Jalen Waddle more when Tyreek Hill isn't on the field. They started going towards Cedric Wilson. What are we doing? Because Jalen Waddle isn't playing bad. He's doing pretty solid with the volume he's getting week in and week out, but this matchup blows going up against the Jets. They allow the fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers in the NFL. But my biggest concern, more than anything else, is the offensive line in Miami. Starting offensive lineman Terron Armstead, questionable to play. Robert Hunt, questionable to play. And they just lost starting guard Connor Williams for the year. We all saw the end of that game in week 14. Tua had no time to do anything in the pocket, and I'm worried that that's what we're going to see a lot of in week 15. But like we always say, if Tyreek Hill is healthy, you can't sit the guy. It's similar to Justin Jefferson. If he's in the lineup for the Dolphins, he's in your fantasy lineup as well. He just faced the Jets a couple weeks ago, had 9 catches for 102 yards and a touchdown. But Waddle, I kind of view him more as a top 24 option than a top 15 option this week, given all the red flags that we see in this matchup. Out to New Orleans now for the Saints and the Giants. And I know for the Giants, a lot of people saw the performance last week of Wan'Dale Robinson and all of a sudden think he's someone that they can potentially throw into their fantasy lineup. That is absolutely crazy to me. And this is what drives me nuts a lot about fantasy football. A guy can suck 73% of the season, but has one good game and all of a sudden becomes an option. That's just not how I operate. Now, sure, Tommy DeVito, he's playing pretty freaking good, but this group of wide receivers in New York have been absolutely atrocious all season long. I am not throwing any of them into my lineup during the fantasy playoffs, especially against the Saints on the road. No, not doing that because the Saints allow the third fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. There are just safer options out there to consider in week 15. How about in New Orleans? Well, we got Chris Olave. And honestly, I just wish they would let Jameis Winston play quarterback for the Saints because Derek Carr rolling out there each and every week, playing with all these injuries is absolutely killing this offense. In a game with no Taysom Hill, with no Rashid Shaheed, no Michael Thomas, it is criminal that Chris Olave only saw 5 targets last week. That's only 3 more than Jimmy Graham. WTF. Luckily, he turned one of those catches into a touchdown. Otherwise, it would have absolutely screwed us with a sub-30-yard day. Olave has still managed to get double-digit points, though, in 5 straight ball games. The problem is none of them are really ceiling games. He's barely squeaking over 10 fantasy points a game, and if he doesn't score a touchdown, you could be in a little bit of trouble. But now they get a matchup going up against the Giants. They allow the 3rd most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. As of right now, Rashid Shaheed and Taysom Hill still questionable to play in this contest. The volume, though, just isn't enough to keep Chris Olave up inside the top 12. Honestly, going forward, probably more of a top 20 option. Which then takes us out to Tennessee for the Titans and the Texans. And I am so sorry, Houston Texans fans. This week may not be pretty. You already lost Tank Dell. Now CJ Stroud is still in concussion protocol, and Nico Collins is highly unlikely to play this week with a calf injury. That leaves us John Mechie, Robert Woods, and Noah Brown. That trio last week combined for 13 targets for only 2 catches and 4 receiving yards. That's not good. Now, Noah Brown is the only one of these guys who's done anything all year long, but he hasn't done anything since week 10 and has now had back-to-back games with 0 fantasy points. Now they get a matchup going up against Tennessee. They allow the 8th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but this team is starting to play a little bit better, and we really saw them hold that Miami Dolphins offense in check last week, a team playing with a lot more confidence there in Tennessee. Plus, we also could have the return this week of Dalton Schultz. Just another mouth to feed, just another way to split targets. Honestly, there is nothing safe about this matchup, especially if we do not have CJ Stroud. If anything, as of right now, Noah Brown is a huge risk play in your flex, but not something that I would do on my fantasy team. Now, as for Tennessee, we had ourselves another D-Hop sighting in week 14. 12 targets, 7 catches, 124 yards, and a touchdown in a comeback victory over the Miami Dolphins, and he looked so good on the field. Or was the defense just playing that bad? Because regardless, DeAndre Hopkins was wide open all over the field, making some crazy catches. He now has touchdowns in 3 of his last 4 games played, and Will Levis is starting to look better each and every week. But really, this entire Titans team is starting to play with so much more confidence, it's boosting the overall production of this offense. Every game for this team is a must-win. If they want to have the slimmest of chances of sneaking into the playoffs, they can't lose again. Now this week in a matchup going up against Houston, they allow just less than the league average to opposing wide receivers. And honestly, I think they smell blood in the water here this week against a divisional opponent and try to kick the Texans while they're down. D-Hop going to be inside my top 25 in week 15. Which then takes us out to New England for Patriots and Chiefs. And just like I've said for many weeks now in Kansas City, the only wide receiver even worth talking about is Rashee Rice. He has 3 straight games now with at least 9+ targets. That's exactly what we're looking for. He's also had touchdowns in 3 of his last 5 and 7+ receptions in 3 straight games as well. And he's done it against some pretty difficult opponents: Buffalo, Green Bay, Las Vegas. He's really taken over that top wide receiver role in this Patrick Mahomes-led offense. But honestly, he's going to be reliant a lot upon Yak. He needs yards after the catch. They're not going deep down the field to Rashee Rice. Now, that's not a bad thing. He's very good at gaining those yards after the catch. But that also means that he's going to need a little bit of volume, so we need him to stay over those 9 targets a week. In a matchup going up against New Orleans here, they allow the 11th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and we also know that Isaiah Pacheco is still questionable to play, which means we could see more throwing once again in Kansas City. He's going to remain inside my top 30 though, somewhere right around wide receiver 25 to 30 each and every week. You have to put the top wide receiver in a Mahomes-led offense at least that high. Anything lower would probably be foolish. Now as for New England, I'm sorry, but just because New England played decent for one half of football last week doesn't mean I'm willing to risk one of their wide receivers in my lineup here this week. Part of me kind of wanted to play a little bit of that Juju revenge game here, but he only has 2 games all year long with over 50 yards receiving and only 1 touchdown on the season, which came 6 weeks ago. Zappy likes to utilize his tight ends and check down to his running backs way too often to trust any wide receiver in New England, especially against Kansas City, since they allow the 9th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. This is also a must-win game for Kansas City. They have been struggling as of late. You know they have to try to come out here and gain momentum end of the season to take it into the playoffs. There is just way too much risk here in New England. I'm not considering any of these guys. Which then takes us back out to the desert for the Cardinals and the San Francisco 49ers. And for San Francisco, I've said it for weeks. I'm going to continue to say it because it continues to be right. When the top offensive weapons are healthy in San Francisco, they are weekly must-start guys. I don't know how I can be any more clear than that. However, it never fails. During rankings videos, each and every week, somebody's going to leave a comment that says Debo is ranked too low. The dude's ranked inside the top 15. I'm telling everybody he's a must-start. If it's not clear enough, maybe you shouldn't be playing fantasy football, because I don't care who the opponent is. I don't care where the game is played. Unless they're outside playing in a hurricane, I'm starting every one of these top offensive options each and every week, especially in matchups like this going up against Arizona, who allows the 12th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. There's nothing to question here. I think we're starting both the wide receiver 12 and 13 overall on the season. What about in Arizona? Not so much. Their offense has really moved to more tight end running back focus, and really they've had to because the health of their wide receivers just hasn't been there. Michael Wilson has missed multiple weeks. Hollywood Brown is still questionable play this week, and they're coming off the bye. That tells you how healthy he really is. And then on top of that, a matchup going up against San Francisco. Now it says they allow the 10th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. They are much easier to throw on than they are to run on. But when you don't have healthy wide receivers to throw to, that is a problem in Arizona. Given all the injuries in this matchup, if it's not Trey McBride, I'm not starting it in Arizona. Which will then take us over to LA for the Rams, and the Washington Commanders will kick it off there in Washington with Terry McLaurin, Jahan Dotson, and Curtis Samuel. Now they're coming off the bye week, and I'm hoping that Terry McLaurin can do a little bit more than just run some cardio out there on the field. In his game before the bye week, he had 3 targets, no catches, and no receptions. That may be the worst performance of his career. I'm hoping his post-game comments, though, maybe lead to more volume here in Week 15. What's crazy, though, is Washington throws the ball more than anyone in the NFL, yet no wide receivers on their team average consistently high volume. Terry, right around 8 targets a game. Dotson, right around 6. And same with Curtis Samuel. They all eat into each other's production each and every week. Now a matchup going up against the Rams. They allow the 16th most fantasy points per game, right there at league average. Brian Robinson, though, is still not practicing due to a hamstring injury, despite coming off the bye week here this week. Now Terry's going to remain my highest ranked wide receiver here on this team in hopes that he gets fed maybe just a little bit extra after he got hosed in that game in Week 13. None of these guys, though, are going to be safe, and all of them will be boomer bust options in Week 15, even though Terry probably going to be verge top 30. But what about in LA? Cooper Kupp and Puka Nacua, they continue to go out there weekly and play through injuries. The fact that we see them limping all over the field, yet when I look at the injury report, neither one of them are on it, is a true testament to their heart. They got that dog in them. I'm just glad that we've gotten back to a point where we can start both Puka and Cooper each and every week at the same time. Now, sure, it's helped that Tyler Higbee and Tutu Atwell have been banged up, but on the other hand, guys like Demarcus Robinson and rookie tight end Davis Allen have stepped right into bigger roles as well. This is just going to be a much better matchup than what they've had here as of late. Going up against Washington, they allow the second most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. With the way that Matthew Stafford is playing, the way this entire Rams offense has been rolling, we just got to get Puka and Cooper back up inside the top 20 here this week in a great matchup. Which will then bring us up to Buffalo for the Bills and the Cowboys. Should be a fun game to watch here. We'll kick it off in Dallas. For CeeDee Lamb, he just continues to be crazy hot. He hasn't had less than 13 fantasy points in a game since week 5. The current wide receiver 2 overall on the season, averaging 18 fantasy points per game. He's a start no matter who he plays each and every week, but what about Brandon Cooks? He's had a few solid weeks here as of late because he's scored at least 14 fantasy points now in 3 of the last 5 games he's played, but really continues to be touchdown dependent, but that's really all because of volume. He doesn't get a whole lot. He's had only over 5 targets in a game 2 times all year long, so we really have to kind of pick and choose what matchups we want to start him in. In this matchup going up against Buffalo, they allow the 13th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. But overall, this offense is healthy, and this is definitely a game that could turn into an offensive shootout if the weather is good. Lamb is going to remain inside my top 10 this week, of course. But Cooks, I just have a few more concerns about. He's going to be one of those fringe top 30 guys for me, but just know if you start him, you're going to need a touchdown. And what the hell has happened here as of late to Stefon Diggs? The dude was the safest wide receiver in fantasy football through the first 9 weeks of the season. Since then, 3 of the 4 games he's played in have resulted in less than 5 fantasy points, and it's not due to volume. He's still getting it. It's really due to matchups. He's had to face the likes of Denver, the Jets, the Kansas City Chiefs. Now he gets Dallas. Just a tough stretch of games for Stefon Diggs, and this week isn't going to be any easier. More than likely going to have to deal with Stephon Gilmore majority of the game. Now, Dallas does allow the 11th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, so it's not like they're absolute shutdown against opposing wide receivers, but it's not an easy matchup either. There are 2 things that I can definitely say here about the Buffalo Bills, being that we're in the fantasy playoffs. One thing is, even though the production has been down, we're not sitting Stefon Diggs. The other one being, there is no way that anyone can trust starting Gabriel Davis. Which then takes us to Sunday Night Football, the Baltimore Ravens and the Jacksonville Jaguars, and we're going double Zay here. Flowers versus Jones. And am I the only one out there kind of thinking to themselves that I'm kind of interested in both Odell Beckham and Zay Flowers here this week? I mean, me likey. And I say that because Zay Flowers has had back-to-back big games now, and Odell just had his best game of the season, 4 catches, 97 yards and a touchdown, and also saw 10 targets last week in that revenge game against the Rams. But this one right here is all about matchup. Jacksonville is tough to run on, but they are Swiss cheese through the air. Baltimore is going to have to throw the ball, and Lamar seems to be in sync quite a bit here with Zay Flowers and Odell Beckham as of late. Sure, these guys aren't going to be some top 12 options in fantasy football, but top 25 to 30, I could definitely see that here this week. Jacksonville allows the 7th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, and they have been torched as of late. Joe Flacco last week just threw for 300 yards and 3 touchdowns against them. With Mark Andrews still out, we have to look at these guys as low-end wide receiver 2 or flex options in deeper leagues. Wouldn't surprise me, though, if both of these guys can find the end zone in week 15. How about for Jacksonville, Calvin Ridley and Zay Jones? And while the volume was there for both of these guys this past week, they couldn't do anything against Cleveland. They had a combined 27 targets, which is great. They turned it into 9 catches for 82 receiving yards, which is not that great. You got to give credit to the Cleveland defense, though. But now they're facing Baltimore. Is this going to be any easier for them? I think it might be slightly. Baltimore has had some struggles here as of late in their secondary, and we just saw Matthew Stafford last week put up some big numbers against this Baltimore Ravens team, so for sure, there's a chance that Trevor Lawrence could do something similar. Now, on the year, Baltimore allows the 7th fewest fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, but you have to think that Baltimore is going to find a way to get up early in this game. If that's the case, Jacksonville's playing catch-up. That's a great opportunity for volume for both of these wide receivers, but are they going to find the end zone? That's the biggest question. Both these guys are going to remain risky starts for me here in week 15. Ridley going to be the higher ranked of the 2, but even he going to be like verge top 30. Which only leaves us Monday Night Football, the Philadelphia Eagles and the Seattle Seahawks. And for Philadelphia, a couple of no-brainers, right? We know we start A.J. Brown, and pretty much we always start Devontae Smith as well. It's nice to see A.J. Brown kind of back on track. Not huge games here as of late, but has scored at least 11 fantasy points now in 3 straight, so we know we lock him in weekly. But what about Devontae Smith? We know that Dallas got it returned just last week. Did it absolutely kill Devontae Smith? No. It didn't. He still saw 10 targets, which is absolutely great, but can it continue? I really think it can. Goddard in his first game back still played 84% of the snaps. He was on the field because those numbers are right on par with where he was at before the injury. Devontae Smith still got his looks, which is great. Plus, you have to think that Philadelphia is in need of a couple wins here to end the season. Remember, they've lost back-to-back games. They need some momentum. They need some big plays. They need to gain some confidence. And it's perfect to do that against Seattle because they allow the 5th most fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers. In a matchup this good on primetime football in a must-win game, I have no issue starting either wide receiver in Philadelphia. How about for Seattle? The biggest question here is who's going to play quarterback for the Seahawks? Is it going to be Geno Smith? Is it going to be Drew Lock? And honestly, we may not find out until we get closer to the game. Either way, though, this is a great opportunity for fantasy points going the way of the Seattle wide receivers. Now, I have to be honest, Lockett and JSN, they have a lot more risk associated with them than that of DK Metcalf. DK still seems to be the top target in this offense and the guy getting the majority of the big plays. He's scored at least 12 fantasy points now in 4 of his last 5 games played, and this could easily be one of those games where defense is optional when we're talking about the passing game. Philadelphia allows the most points per game to opposing wide receivers of any team in the NFL. Regardless of who the quarterback is, DK is going to be verge top 12 in my rankings, where both Tyler Lockett and JSN, they're going to be verge top 30 boom or bust style plays here in week 15. All right, that's going to do it for my wide receiver start and sit video here in week 15 of fantasy football. Hopefully I was able to give you some information to help make those lineup decisions a little bit easier. Remember, we will still have our rankings videos out Thursday morning, but it's the fantasy playoffs. Don't get too cute. Start your studs, trust your gut, and then walk away with the fantasy football championships at the end of the season. But I'm going to go ahead and get out of here for the day. Hopefully you guys enjoy the rest of your day, and then most importantly, do your part to make the world a better place.